I think we have announcements about participation in translation.
Yes, thank you. This evening, we are offering Spanish interpretation service. If you are joining the meeting using the Zoom application, you'll be able to select either English or Spanish. Their interpretation is now live. Panelists will need to select English on their Zoom toolbar from the interpretation button. When selecting Spanish, it is recommended to select mute original audio to listen to the meeting only in Spanish. Our interpreter will now make the announcement in Spanish.
Gracias mil. Any other announcements we need to make? Okay.
I can share the announcement for the public comments if you'd like.
So let me just get to roll call, which I
Sure.
do see that both Councilmember Salinas and Councilmember Wahab are with us, and apparently I am too. So I think we are all here. And yeah, if you would go ahead with the public comment announcement, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. If you wish to speak and you're using the Zoom application, please click the raise hand button. If you are dialing in, press *9 to raise your hand on the phone and *6 to unmute yourself. If you're streaming the meeting through Zoom on your computer, but dialing in via phone, please make sure to mute yourself so that there's no feedback sound during the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I hear Yuma has made her public comments, so that's a good sign. And if there are any comments that are not related to today's agenda items, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. I see Ro has her hand up. And so Ro, this will be a comment that's not related to either of the two work session items today. Or okay, got it. Okay. Any other non-agenda item public comments? Seeing none, we'll move on to approval of the minutes. Do I have either? Item. Thank you, Councilmember Wahab.
Second.
Thank you. Do we need to do a roll call vote for that?
I don't think we need to.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Okay.
It's the teleconference thing. So would you mind, Irene? Or
sure.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lemon.
Aye.
Councilmember Salinas.
Yes.
Councilmember Wahab.
Yes.
Thank you. And that passes unanimously. And welcome, Irene. We're happy to have you. And so that leads us to our first work session item, which is our Affordable Housing Ordinance Feasibility Study. These are the preliminary findings and policy recommendations. So we'll do, as we normally do, our staff report, public comments, and then comments and questions from our council members. So who's kicking us off?
Oh, did you want to? I guess I will be
say yes. Christina Morales is kicking us off.
Good evening, council members and members of the community. I'm Christina Morales, Housing Division Manager, and we are here today with the preliminary findings from the feasibility study regarding the Affordable Housing Ordinance. Council had directed staff to evaluate the Affordable Housing Ordinance and with the intention of increasing the supply of affordable housing. As part of that, in March in 2022, earlier this year, we looked at the outcomes and the performance of the existing ordinance, and based on feedback we received from the council, we hired Strategic Economics to conduct a feasibility study in terms of what capacity development has in terms of supporting affordable housing, inclusionary housing ordinance, and the fees. So I am going to, most of the Strategic Economics is going to present their preliminary findings and then give council an opportunity to discuss these findings. So I'm going to introduce Derek Braun and Dina Belzer from Strategic Economics, and Derek Braun will be leading us in the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christina. It's nice to meet you, Chair Lamden, Councilmember Salinas, Councilmember Wahab. I am Derek Braun, I'm Principal of Strategic Economics, and we're also joined by Dina Belzer, who is the president of the firm. I'm going to first walk through a presentation of the findings, which are a little bit more detailed, reflect what was in your agenda packet. So give me just one moment to get set up on screen share here. Irene, it looks like my screen sharing has been disabled.
Sure, let me fix that for you.
Well, while Irene is addressing that, I can actually start up with some pieces of the presentation that you don't really need to see. So, you know, the purpose of today's conversation really is to review the findings and preliminary recommendations that came out of the analysis by Strategic Economics for updating the Affordable Housing Ordinance, which includes, this update includes the inclusionary housing requirements, as well as the in lieu fee payments. And really what we're seeking today is to hear discussion, your direction on further refining the affordable housing policy recommendations.
You can go ahead, Derek, sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So as the components of this presentation include an overview of affordable housing development and feasibility concepts, sort of why we do these financial feasibility analyses and kind of how they work. And then I'm going to kind of provide an overview of the policy, comparing policies between Hayward and other communities and looking at how those policies have resulted in production of affordable housing over the last few years, just to sort of ground the existing policy in its performance. And then I'll walk through the findings of our new analysis, which includes the feasibility analysis of the existing policy and alternative policy scenarios, which will lead into recommendations. So just to start off, to reintroduce the policy itself, you know, this policy was initially created, the Affordable Housing Ordinance policy was created in 2003 and updated in 2017 with the purpose of increasing the in lieu fees, applying the Affordable Housing Ordinance to smaller projects down to projects of 2 or more units, and increasing the flexibility for means of compliance, including the in lieu fee payments. This current update is really about ensuring that the Affordable Housing Ordinance maximizes the production of affordable housing. And the process, of course, includes the analysis of the alternatives. And once we have the alternatives a little bit more settled and decisions made about sort of the nature of the in lieu fee, we'll also calculate what's called the affordability gap to establish the maximum in lieu fee. And that's basically the equivalent cost of how much it costs for a developer to provide an affordable unit. And then that's the basis of the fee. We've done a lot of work up to this point. The grayed out parts of this project timeline show work completed. We've completed market research and developer interviews to establish the development prototypes and the inputs to the feasibility analysis. We've completed our analysis of pure city policies and housing production, held a meeting with our technical advisory committee, which I'll discuss in a moment. We've tested some of the preliminary policy alternatives and also developed the preliminary recommendations. Looking ahead after this meeting, there is a community workshop that's going to be scheduled for October or possibly early November to get input on the policy recommendations. We will then further refine and test some additional policy alternatives based on your feedback at this meeting, bring that back to the technical advisory committee and develop these final recommendations and report. This will all, of course, be heard by the Planning Commission and the City Council. Speaking of the technical advisory committee, the purpose of the technical advisory committee that's been convened is to provide feedback on the assumptions and development prototypes and the analysis results to sort of ground truth it with folks who are active in development in Hayward. Members include 5 participants, including Kate Blessing Kawamura of Eden Housing, that's an affordable housing developer, and then 4 developers of market rate housing with experience in the city, Stephen Clark of Amcal Housing, Avery Jones of DR Horton, Derek Larson of Dillinger Properties, and Kristen Paulett of Taylor Morrison. And I just want to say many thanks to those folks for participating and giving up their time and sharing their expertise on the TAC. Okay, so just to start off with, I'm going to start at sort of a conceptual level to discuss, how, when we say financial feasibility development, what are we talking about? And how does that relate back to some of the affordable housing production tools that you have? So just broadly speaking, what is financial feasibility when we talk about it for a project? Well, development projects are feasible when revenues exceed project costs and required investment return. And this is a pretty straightforward idea of, you need to make money to cover the cost of building a project. And I'm going to walk through the components of the costs here in the right bar. And then they need to be covered by the market value, which could be the sales prices of the units or the value of the rents that are generated, the stream of income generated from the rents. Now, developers, of course, only build projects when those projects pencil. When they are, as we say, financially feasible. It's important to remember that costs and revenues are very dynamic and often beyond the control of a city. And we'll walk through those, like I said. So on the cost side of this equation, the largest portion of costs for any development project are hard costs. This includes labor, construction materials, site work. It's basically the process of physically building the project. Now, these costs can vary. These costs will vary by building type. For example, wood frame construction for a modest size structure is relatively inexpensive, but as you have greater life safety requirements and you need concrete and steel for larger projects, for taller projects, you start to have higher costs per square foot. It's important to remember that construction costs for hard costs especially are regional. There's some control at a city level over some portions of some of the costs, but really the hard costs, those labor costs and materials costs function at the regional level, regardless of whether you're in Hayward or on the peninsula or in the North Bay. The next component of costs are soft costs, which are things like architecture and engineering, city fees, financing costs, taxes, insurance, and accounting. Then there are land costs. Now, land costs are much more variable than other development costs. Land costs really depend on what is allowed to be built on a site. How desirable is the site for the given use? Is it near amenities for housing, for example, or access to jobs? What's the condition of the land? What's the cost to bring the land up to development readiness? From a developer's perspective, these land costs are what we call residual. It's the value that's based on what developers could afford to pay while also delivering a feasible project. If a project just appears infeasible, or if there are other opportunities on the land, developers might look for something else. And when you have multiple land uses competing for the same potential property, if there's zoning that allows multiple land uses, then that's the idea of highest and best use. It's the idea of the ability of one use to outcompete the other use, like office versus residential. And then, of course, there's investment return. And for a developer, the investment return is a critical part of funding their project because these projects have to be able to attract outside capital. And you can think of it just as, this capital flows very easily. And so if a development project doesn't offer adequate return compared to other safer investments or equivalent investments, then it's unlikely to attract that investment from to the project. And the investment return that's required will really depend on the risk. Riskier projects will require higher return. And then we have on the revenue side, the idea of market demand, which sets the price that buyers and renters are willing or able to pay. This part is very local, and you'll see in our analysis that we broke down sub areas of the city and looked at different tiers of prices and rents. So one thing to keep in mind with all that said, is that policies and incentives the city deploys can impact financial feasibility. For example, if you reduce parking ratios and the market doesn't require more parking to make projects marketable, then that could potentially reduce construction costs by reducing the number of parking spaces required. Or you can also move things like the soft costs that go towards city fees. You can provide density bonuses that might, not always, but for a financially feasible project might increase the value of the project. And then there are things like reducing the time for the project to be approved, streamlining of approvals, creating greater certainty, which would reduce the investment return required. Another big concept now, moving into more of the concept of affordable housing and what do we mean by that? We think of housing costs as being considered affordable when they're 30% of or less of household income. Housing costs include rent as well as utilities typically. Households are considered to be cost burdened if they pay more than 30% of their income towards housing expenses. In Hayward, about 63% of households are not cost burdened. And you can see 24% of households are renters who are, 14% of households are owner occupied who are. When we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about deed restricted housing that is affordable at specific income levels, which are based on the area median income. And this here on the right shows the percent of area median income that describes very low, low income, moderate income, above moderate income under the current AHO, as well as extremely low income. This is in the weeds a little, but this differs from the tax credit allocation committee in California, which makes decisions about low-income housing tax credits, which are a key funding source for 100% affordable housing. So there's a slight difference in how the AHO is structured versus the limits used by the TCAC. And we can unpack that later if you want. So then, as far as the affordable rents and sales prices, those income limits are translated into specific rents, of course, and sales prices by income level. So you can see in Hayward, for a 1-bedroom unit that is affordable at low income, for example, the maximum housing cost right now is $1,714 a month. So, okay, just want to recap for a moment. We covered the overview of how financial feasibility works, what do we mean by it, how policy decisions affect feasibility, and our definitions of affordable housing. I just want to close out this little topic by looking at the two primary means of delivering affordable units and how they affect project feasibility. So of course, with the AHO, one big piece of it is inclusionary housing. These programs require developers to provide units at specific below market rate costs, or typically it's below market rate. And you can see here the effect really is it reduces the project value, which if the project, there's only so much of that value that can be reduced before the project becomes infeasible. But of course, the nice thing about inclusionary requirements is that it is a developer funded source, and it's also the income thresholds are set at the city level. The other way of providing affordable housing is the tax credit projects, those low income housing tax credits, the 100% affordable housing projects. And these projects are able to typically provide housing at lower income levels, extremely low income, very low income, low income, because the level of subsidy required is so high that it's difficult for inclusionary housing requirements to achieve that. So Hayward's inclusionary requirements are set at low and moderate incomes, for example. The benefits of these 100% affordable projects is that they can leverage a lot of outside funding sources like tax credits. And they do achieve greater affordability and a greater number of units that are affordable. The challenges with this is that sometimes you need to have you do need to have a source of outside funding that's a match for a local source of funding to match outside dollars. And also some of those outside funding sources are very competitive. And I should also mention for these projects, typically they don't target moderate income households. That's something that's generally best achieved with inclusionary requirements. Okay, so that's all sort of context. I'm going to present what we found from the comparison to some other cities around Hayward, looking at their requirements and Hayward's requirements. So the current policy in Hayward is that the inclusionary requirement is that 6% of units in rental projects need to be deed restricted affordable. In this case, 50% of them affordable at very low income, the other half of them available at low income. So that's for rental. For ownership housing, it's based on, the inclusion requirement is based on the density of the project. If it's above 35 dwelling units per acre, it's a 7.5% requirement. Less than 35 DUs per acre, it's a 10% requirement. And the affordability level is 100%, as all moderate income units, with the logic behind that being sometimes if you target lower affordability levels with ownership housing, there's no limit on the costs that might be incurred for maintenance of the home, for HOA dues, for condo association fees. So there's a point at which it becomes sort of infeasible for those households to afford those units over time. The current policy does apply to all projects with 2 or more units, and it also offers in lieu fee options of $21.64 per habitable square foot of rental housing, and between $17.85 to $21.64 for ownership housing. And then also developers can propose alternative mitigations for compliance that have to be approved. So with that in mind, we looked at the equivalent policies in a set number of cities near Hayward or sharing some characteristics with Hayward. So we looked at Concord, El Cerrito, Fremont, Newark, Richmond, San Leandro, and Union City. This is a lot. I'm not going to walk through it all, but you have it to digest at your leisure. But I think when we looked at the data, what we found really is that Hayward's requirements do apply to relatively small projects compared to those cities. Only Fremont and Hayward apply the requirements universally to 2-unit projects. Most communities, it's 4 to 10 units as a minimum. Hayward's required set aside, the inclusionary percentage is lower than other communities at 6% versus 10% to 15% in other communities. And some of those communities like Newark and Richmond actually prefer fee payments instead of on-site inclusionary units. We did find that the targeted income levels of low and moderate income are pretty typical in Hayward versus those other communities. So what's the outcome? We examined what's the affordable deed restricted units that have been produced from 2018 to 2021 in all those communities by income level. So very low income, and moderate income. In orange, it's the inclusion, those are the units produced through inclusionary requirements. And in blue, it's the units produced by 100% affordable housing. And what we found is that inclusionary housing is actually a pretty small share of overall deed restricted unit production. But Hayward, with its relatively low requirement, has actually been fairly successful in delivering inclusionary units. And I should note, it's possible some of these projects entered the process of permitting under the old affordable housing ordinance requirements. But from 2018 to 2021, you can see Hayward and Fremont were some of the only cities that actually delivered inclusionary units at low income. You can see that most moderate income units are delivered via inclusionary, but again, primarily Hayward and Fremont in this case. Now, in looking at those 100% affordable projects, really in lieu fee revenue is a major source of funding for those projects. And I'm just showing this to provide some context because there's a tension in getting inclusionary units in projects versus in lieu fee revenue sometimes, and they can be used in different ways or serve different purposes. So for Hayward, what we did is we examined the percent of the local funding contribution for 100% affordable housing units or projects from 2015 to 2023. And this is the percent breakdown of funding coming from local funding coming from the housing trust fund in each city, Fremont in orange, Hayward in blue. And that's your in lieu fee revenue basically. And you can see it's a big component of the funding for those 100% affordable projects. Hayward has a lot in other because of public land contributions primarily, as well as some bond funding, Alameda County Measure A1 bond revenue. So public lands also can play a big role in this. Now, of course, Hayward's overall production of housing by income level, it has been falling behind its goals for producing very low income and moderate income housing. So you can see Hayward only produced about 32% of its moderate income goal for the 5th cycle regional housing needs allocation, which is 2015 to 2023. And then you can see Hayward produced 57% of its extremely low or very low income goal down here. It has been relatively successful in producing low and above moderate housing. And so really it's the moderate income housing, as I've said, that's often delivered through inclusionary requirements. The very low and extremely low often delivered through 100% affordable projects. And the requirements are for the next cycle are in orange, and they are higher. So in looking at all this, putting all this together from this examination of peer cities and performance of the current affordable housing ordinance, it's interesting because Hayward's relatively low inclusionary requirement actually produced a pretty high number of affordable low and moderate income housing units, especially compared to many other communities. So it speaks in many ways to how that may have worked fairly well with financial feasibility and market conditions at the time for many of those units. There's a suggestion, the possibility that it's worth reconsidering application of inclusionary requirements to the 2-unit projects or related to the in lieu fees to the 2-unit projects, because the cost burden can be pretty high for the in lieu fee on those small projects, and the inclusionary requirements can be very difficult to administer for the maybe one affordable unit that's on site in smaller projects. If you shift away from the moderate income requirements, then that would have the effect of eliminating the primary means of delivering moderate income units, because that's how this has been working for Hayward so far. And then the in lieu fee option would support development of 100% affordable projects as well. Okay, so that's sort of backwards looking. And now let's dive in and look at the current policy, feasibility of the current policy and some alternatives. What we did for our analysis is we developed 6 development prototypes for different housing products. And again, this is too much information, but I wanted you to have it so you could look at it in more detail. But basically the product types that we looked at were single family homes, essentially a single family home development of multiple single family homes. We examined the financial feasibility of townhomes, and then the single family and townhomes, those are both ownership products. We also looked at small multifamily rental projects. We examined the financial feasibility of a generic stacked flats rental project, which would look something like this. It's a little bit more intense. And then we also examined the financial feasibility of 2 5-story rental project types. One would be a wrap, in which housing is wrapped around a parking garage. The other is a podium, in which the housing is built atop a concrete parking podium, and it tends to be a little bit more expensive than a wrap. I said earlier that we looked at different submarkets in Hayward. So this is just a rough map, an approximate map of how we set up some different tiers for sales prices per square foot and rental rates per square foot of new development in our feasibility analysis. So basically the tier 1 submarkets, it's areas that are commanding the highest rents in the city. And we set rents that are based on the data that appeared to be roughly appropriate for tier 1. And then we also had slightly lower amounts in tier 2 and 3. This is, like I said, a fairly approximate map, but it gives you a sense of sort of where we saw stronger market conditions, especially for rental primarily in this map. So what do we find? We found through the financial feasibility analysis that really only single family homes and townhomes, those 2 ownership product types, are consistently feasible under the existing affordable housing ordinance requirements. And those product types can actually support higher requirements potentially. We found that the smaller rental projects, such as the small multifamily, are largely infeasible under the current requirements, but the small multifamily ones do perform a little bit better. And then the higher density rental projects, the 5-story wrap and podium projects, they really are unlikely to achieve financial feasibility. And the way that I'm showing the results here is in orange, it's no affordable requirements applied to the project. Gray is the existing inclusionary requirements, and yellow is the existing in lieu fee requirements. Basically, the light gray horizontal bar indicates the typical range of land values that would need to be met through a project being built. And so those are basically your land sales prices. And so if these bars are within or above that range, then the project is likely feasible and able to support requirements, or well, I should say it's likely feasible and able to support requirements if it's the gray or yellow. And then anything that falls below the light gray bar is an infeasible project. And this is looking at the tier 2 submarket values. We found that these findings are largely consistent across all the different market tiers that we tested. Really only single family homes and townhomes are consistently financially feasible, those two ownership product types that are fairly low density compared to the others. Small multifamily product types can also achieve feasibility in the strongest market locations, essentially. So our suggested responses based on those findings are that the city might consider higher inclusionary percentages for ownership housing, those single family homes and townhomes, deeper affordability levels for ownership housing as a potential alternative, or decreased requirements for rental housing. We ran this by the TAC, and they basically felt that this was reflective of current market conditions in Hayward. They also noted a few other ideas that marketing and administering inclusionary units is a challenge for small projects, and that production of affordable housing could be enhanced via a number of steps, such as waiving impact fees for affordable units and projects, maintaining more consistent public funding for assisting affordable housing projects, those 100% affordable. That would include fee revenue and lieu fee revenue. Granting ministerial approval for affordable projects, aligning the inclusionary unit affordability levels with the TCAC levels. This is primarily for those 100% affordable projects where there's currently a disconnect between the inclusionary affordability levels and the tax credit allocation affordability levels. And then also building public-private partnerships for affordable and mixed income projects. We tested a few alternatives for the ownership and rental products in our financial feasibility analysis. For ownership products, we tested some stronger requirements. The current AHO is 7.5% to 10% of units at moderate income. We tested a higher inclusionary percentage, all low income, a higher inclusionary percentage, all moderate income, and a higher inclusionary percentage at low, moderate, at a 50-50 split of low and moderate income requirements. For rental products, we tested, since the rental products are largely infeasible, we focused more on what's the percent increase in rent that would be necessary to make the project feasible. And here we tested some sort of less impactful requirements. So 6% of the units at moderate income instead of at 50-50 very low and low income. We tested maintain the 50-50 split, but make it low income and moderate income at 1.5% and 1.5%, so 3% total requirement. And then we also tested having the current in lieu fee to be $10.82 per habitable square foot. What we found is that in each of these scenarios, single family homes and townhomes can support increased inclusionary requirements, depending on how deep the affordability level is. So at the low income scenario, they could support 12.5% inclusionary, moderate income 16% inclusionary, or 15% inclusionary at a 50-50 low and moderate income split. One note I want to share is typically it's a good idea to set your inclusionary requirement a bit lower than the maximum found through an analysis like this, just to account for changing market conditions over time, because if it really is the absolute maximum, then there's really no room should there be a slight market downturn or an increase in construction costs. As far as the rental housing results and the test of those scenarios, we found basically that the small multifamily projects are sometimes currently feasible. I do want to note the small multifamily projects are sometimes difficult to deliver for other reasons, such as they don't deliver a lot of units at once, so that they don't attract a lot of development interest from larger developers and from really well-capitalized sources. There aren't a lot of sites that provide the right sort of combination of size and zoning and context for those projects. But the small multifamily, on the face of it, they often are feasible. And that's what this shows is the percent increase in rents required to make these projects work, make them pencil. And it's negative for the small multifamily projects because they're already feasible. They can support the current requirements. And then you can see the different scenarios down here. All the other projects, this shows the impact of the existing inclusionary with a percent increase in rents required to cover the existing inclusionary and make the project pencil in light blue. And then the other bars show the percent increase in rents required under the different tested scenarios. And you can see There's not a ton of variability in many cases in many of these different scenarios. They kind of land in a similar place in the overall increase in rents required. The way we think of this is that it's sort of a question of timing. How long do you have to sort of wait for rents to increase, for market conditions to improve before developers will start initiating projects? And so that's why we're illustrating the results in this way. So just to wrap up, I know it's been a long presentation. For the recommendations coming out of this for sale housing, and these are preliminary recommendations that we should discuss, but for sale housing, we recommend potentially increasing the inclusionary, increasing the inclusionary requirement to approximately 12%. We found that ownership products, again, can support 12.5 to 16%. We also recommend for the for sale housing targeting those moderate income households because they can more readily absorb maintenance costs and HOA dues. So the moderate income affordability level makes a lot of sense for ownership housing. If low income households are included for ownership housing in the requirements, then it's important to make sure that the purchase price calculation, the supportable percent of income towards housing, incorporates an adjustment for those households to be able to cover maintenance and homeowner association or condo association costs. We also recommend for ownership housing to maintain the current lower inclusionary requirement or a lower inclusionary requirement for higher density ownership product types. Higher density condominium products aren't even really getting built in Hayward right now. We might test a version of this in the coming month, but really it's pretty clear that they're infeasible at the moment. For rental housing, recommendations are to consider suspending or significantly reducing the inclusionary and in lieu fee requirements for all rental products, or to temporarily adopt a significantly reduced in lieu fee option. One other recommendation is to adopt relatively lower inclusionary requirements and in lieu fees for higher density projects above 40 dwelling units per acre, because those are the projects that are really struggling to achieve feasibility and it might take some time. Also in rental housing, we recommend exploring incentives to enhance the feasibility of the housing, such as reduced parking requirements or impact fee waivers, potentially increased allowable density. And then on project size, we recommend examining, being willing to consider accepting in lieu fee payments for smaller projects relatively simply and easily. So for projects of 20 or fewer units, sort of defaulting to the in lieu fee rather than the inclusionary requirements, just because of, again, those issues of administering a single inclusionary unit can be very difficult for those small and expensive for those small projects. And the in lieu fee revenue, even if it's not enormous because they're small projects, over time that can accrue and allow the city to produce more affordable units at deeper levels of affordability. So that's the presentation. I hope you're still with me. It's been a long presentation, I know, but please, we welcome your questions, your reactions. We'd just like to have a robust discussion about everything that you've heard here.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much. So we'll go next to our community members, so folks who have public comments on this item specifically. Feel free to raise your hand at this point. Our standard time of 3 minutes will apply. And I see Ms. Rowe Aguilar. And somebody can help her.
Hello?
We can hear you, Ro.
Oh, good. Okay. I had to do an unmute on some other screen that wasn't up. Okay. So it looks like some of these results are supporting my advocacy. So I'm happy to see that in terms of inclusionary owner-occupied housing. Now, I have 3 requests of the council, of the task force and the council. Require inclusionary affordable housing on developments of more than 20 units now, when you adopt the housing plan, require it now at the current rates. You don't have to change the minimum percentage now. Just make it a requirement and eliminate this in lieu option. So we start now with the current percentages, minimum percentages, and as a requirement, and we eliminate the in lieu fee option on inclusionary affordable housing. And then on home ownership, continue to provide incentives like density bonus, fast tracking, dedicated city staffing to reduce developer costs, and change the affordable housing, as I said now, in terms of home ownership. That is the single family, the townhouses, and the multifamily housing. Because right now that looks good. Let's do it now. It's needed now. We're in a crisis, and it's doable. And then we can finish our study to 2023 on all of this, and then in 2024 decide if we want to raise the percentages. See how these current percentages do with requiring developers. So I hope I'm making myself clear. And then I just wanted to say that there was an article in the paper, Sunday paper, the Times, about tiny homes, which I hope staff can get for you. The cost of effectiveness of tiny homes, it's not as bright as some people think, but I know it's more politically acceptable. But we need to talk about cost effectiveness for in regards to tiny homes. And the third thing is I had wanted to, in public comments, wish Aisha good luck in her campaign and congratulate Mark and Sarah on their successful campaigns. So that was my public comment at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ro. Are there any other public comments? Seeing none.
Nobody else is participating in this?
No.
We'll go back to my colleagues, and I see Councilmember Wahab.
Thank you. Thank you, Ro, for your advocacy. I really do appreciate it. Do you guys mind if we put up the slides on the recommendations?
Sure. One moment. There we go. Which
Okay.
set? For sale, rental?
Or
Or...
let's start at the very beginning of the recommendation section.
Sure. Here we are.
Okay. So, I found it interesting. On one piece, I think I heard you say that we charge for in lieu on the rental housing more than we do for ownership. Is that correct?
Let me just make sure I'm answering you properly. Let's go.
It's at the very beginning of your presentation. I just wanted to make sure.
Yes.
I think the distinction is there's a different rate for the high density condominium projects, but for the lower density ownership project, the rate is the same.
That's right.
Okay, for a single family, it would be what?
So for single family, it would be the same as rental. It's $21.64 per habitable square foot.
Okay, and then just for, let's say, condos or townhomes, it would be?
Most of those projects would probably come in still under, well, for townhomes, $21.64 per habitable square foot. To get to the 35 dwelling units an acre and up for that lower amount, you're probably looking at more of a condominium project.
Okay.
A multi-unit step plan.
And with that said, I wish that we had maybe a little bit more data as to what types of homes have been developed, because I don't feel like we have 40 units per acre being created in Hayward at this moment in time. I don't even feel like we got close to it, right? Let alone the 35 per acre. That's my personal opinion. I don't feel like we've seen that, right? So I do just want to highlight that. And then if we can go to the recommendations.
Sure.
Sorry, I know it's a lot of slides.
No, that's okay.
Okay. Okay. So I also wanted to highlight the comparison of the cities that we compared ourselves to. So Fremont, Richmond, Union City, that's nice. I would like to compare ourselves also to other cities. So for example, I do know that San Francisco, for example, has increased their percentage requirement, correct?
The San Francisco, they did a few years ago. What they're finding right now is that they've had a huge slowdown in housing production recently, and they've just reconvened their task force to re-examine their inclusionary requirements and in-lieu fees.
Okay, and the one difference between San Francisco and Hayward is I feel like we actually have more potential to build up. San Francisco, I feel like when I walk there, where else do they have to build, right, at this point, right? Because they have gone through that whole high density. So I do believe that we can definitely increase the inclusionary requirement. I would even go up to 15%. I think I've said this many, many times. And obviously we can work with the developer that if they don't hit that 15%, even if they want to do 10% and they pay 5% in lieu, I'd prefer something like that personally. But I do think that we can be a little bit more aggressive on the for sale housing. Inclusionary is really, really important because I understand that a lot of the affordable housing groups rely on the in lieu fee, but if we are not creating affordable housing as we are moving forward and we're waiting 3 years to absorb enough inclusionary fees to build one project of extremely low or low income, we are displacing people as we speak, right? So I really want to stress that as much as possible. That is my concern. That is why the rent control piece was important and expanding that. And when we talk about, we highlight preserve, protect, and produce, we do need to protect the people that are currently housed and then preserve what we can, and then obviously produce as we move along. So I do just want to highlight that. I know a lot of the affordable housing groups rely on those in lieu fees, but the fact of the matter is that if we create only extremely low income or low income, we are completely ignoring the missing middle. And a lot of us in Bay Area jobs, you make a certain amount of money that you do not qualify to hit those. So we are already pushing people out. So I do just want to highlight that as much as possible, but I think that we can go a little bit higher on this. I have constantly said I don't like HOA fees, but I know that the moderate income households can afford it, but it's getting the HOA fees are becoming $500 a month, $600 a month and more. So it's almost it is unaffordable in my opinion, right? So I think that we would need to address that. I'm more supportive of waiving impact fees in some capacity, having a sliding scale on that. I think staff would have to come back with potential options around that, but those are some of the things that I would consider. And then also the higher density. I think we do need to start asking for higher density. But with, to Rose's point, I've never been a fan of the tiny homes. I think it's a great transition from homelessness to housing and rentals, but realistically, it's just a waste of space and it costs a lot. So I'm hoping that we can kind of create a space of whether it's a single room or something like that, but like roughly about 500 square feet, have people be able to live with some dignity. And it's mixed income housing development. So it's, let's say, slightly smaller units, let's say 500 square feet on the bottom, penthouses up top. This is how we can make sure that our city is diverse and we're not creating low income housing somewhere and up in the hills, the wealthier single family, 20 acres, lots. So I've said this many times, but we can go to the next one. Next slide.
Sure. Is it all right if I ask a clarifying question or two?
Oh, yes, for sure.
Okay, so on the idea of sort of the mixed income and mixed unit size, the current inclusionary requirement specifies that the affordable units have to be basically comparable to the market rate units. And I think that would have to go away in order to have a difference in units. Is that something that you might be comfortable with?
I don't want smaller homes. I feel that, the tiny homes, I feel like there's a lack of reality in those, right? Because people have guests over, people have company over, and the smaller it is, I know it's more financially feasible for the developer, but that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in a better quality of life, even for those that, make less money and can only afford a smaller unit. So that's where I stand on that.
I see. So just avoid really tiny units.
Yes,
basically.
right.
Okay.
And staff can look in that because I know we don't have the details here in this particular report, but just being able to see what we've created, what is the average unit size, and moving forward. So when this comes back to us with a little bit more detail around that as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Here's rental housing.
Okay. Yeah. So like I said, I don't feel like we make the 40 dwelling units per acre. Do we have any data off the top of your head that what have we done in the city of Hayward?
We did examine the current development projects. I don't have it open in front of me, but those higher density projects are pretty few and far between in the city. I think there were some multifamily projects that were built, but most of them were permitted under the previous inclusionary requirements rather than these current ones.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can jump in. There's two mixed income projects that are in South Hayward. You have Sohay, and then you have Parcel Group 2, but both have had a mix of townhomes that actually cross-subsidized the higher density product. And then you had Lincoln Landing on the north, but that was under the previous affordable housing fees, and it had opportunity zone financing. Kind of, it sat for a while, not being able to get their permits, and then eventually got some opportunity zone financing that helped them kind of, but very little kind of strictest multifamily housing that's been built.
Okay. And then I feel like we genuinely lost out on the Sohay project because of the lack of affordable housing. And so if we are, and I know we are working really hard on creating higher density, but I think that we need to really define what higher density really means to us, right? I don't think that we've created anything that's really higher density except for the Sohay project that we've been seeing. So I do feel like we need to build upwards, and I know that it costs more, but I do just want to say to the developers we do talk to that we are happier to move upwards, if you will. Number one. Number two is I do not want to reduce the parking requirements. And the reason why is because we already have a lot of complaints of the lack of parking in the city of Hayward. Even if you go towards the hills near Cal State East Bay, everyone who drives, whether it's an SUV or, a mid-sized sedan or whatever, they can genuinely not park on any of the streets, right? It's a two-way street and you feel like you're about to hit all the parked cars, right? I do not want to create that poor planning model. I think that parking needs to be there. I know it's expensive. I understood the whole wraparound parking versus build on top. I think that we do need to make that a requirement to have at least 2 spaces per house or home. I still think that, adults work, they commute. We do not have the infrastructure for public transportation yet, and we won't 10, 15, 20 years down the line at the same time. So I really want to highlight that. And then I do feel comfortable with impact fee waivers. I'm fine with that, where we eat the cost. But I think parking it's really a requirement. I've said this a million times. So, and then the increased allowable density needs to go up. But again, with, respect to the size of the units and so forth. So, I'm kind of right there on that. And then we can go to the next one too.
Sure. May I share one thought from what you
Yes.
just said? Is that okay? So, so much of what we look at as part of these analyses comes down to these trade-offs, right? And so I do just want to note that one of the greatest expenses for these higher density product types, like those 40 dwelling unit and acre and up product types, is the parking construction. And so at 2 spaces per home, those products rarely get built at that parking ratio just because the cost to support the parking construction is so high. So I'm just pointing this out as a trade-off between, you can either sort of get the high density or the increased parking, but it's very challenging to sort of achieve both in these projects.
Yeah, and I get that, but I do just want to highlight. So, for example, I live in a multifamily complex. When I first moved here, almost a decade ago, they genuinely had it where, you know, you could have whatever many parkings you want. Every single unit has multiple adults. Every adult has a vehicle they drive. I think two is realistic. I'm gonna just be very, very frank. And I know it's a hardship, but I think that that's something that, you know, needs to be a requirement where we just, you know, waive the impact fees. So it's kind of like, okay, if you do this, roughly 1.5 vehicles or two vehicles at a preferred standard, we'll do X, Y, and Z. I think that that's kind of where I'd like to see kind of potential the conversation going. But again, because I just want to say also, especially for rental housing, we pay for our parking space every single month, right? We pay for our dog every single month, right? So it's to a point where money is being made, but let's make sure that we are accommodating the actual residents and the quality of life. Because if you park on the side of a street, near a church, near a store, your car gets broken into, it's not creating a good quality of life for a lot of people. So I do just want to talk about the realities of that, but we can go to the next slide.
Your meet at 8.
Yeah, sorry. You know, I'm open to this. I think that I think if it, you know, there are, especially with SB 9 and 10, with smaller units potentially going up, you know, with ADUs being created, with the changes that we may want to revisit this. So I'm kind of comfortable with this, and we can move on to the next slide.
That was actually it for the recommendations.
All right, I appreciate it. Again, thank you all for working on this. I'm looking forward to seeing hopefully this a little bit more, but more data. But other than that, I again appreciate it. I think you guys did a great job and you covered a lot of things. But more affordable housing, 100% higher density, and let's see, you know, how parking works. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Council member Salinas, do you have, guessing you have questions? There you are.
Yeah. Can you go back to start with the recommendations at the beginning? Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for the presentation. To some extent, I felt like I was sitting in a crash course graduate seminar on on how to build affordable housing. So I don't know if you're a professor in housing somewhere, but you sure do synthesize a lot of great data. So thank you for an easily understandable presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to respond to Ro Aguilar. I know she calls in a lot, and she certainly is she certainly demonstrates that she reads everything that comes across her her table. I did read that. I did see that article on tiny homes, and I've on Mondays and Wednesdays, I like tiny homes. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I don't like tiny homes, and on Friday, it depends how I feel. I like them or not. And I think with that article, I think that the thrust of that article is that they're not as cost effective, or they're not as cost feasible, I guess, as some might think. And plus we also, one thing that we don't realize is the impact that ADUs have, the different impact ADUs have in different neighborhoods. And so I have anyways, I read the same, I'm reading the same stuff, Ms. Aguilar, and I totally get what you're saying. And, and there's some things that you have said that, I think we've been working on for a long time. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. The other thing I wanted to say is, this is this was quite a deep dive. The staff report was good. I'm glad this is going to be posted on the website soon, because I think this really does, especially the video. I think this is a great supplemental sort of add-on to the slide. I think it shows a lot of the work that we've been doing. And, you know, and at the end of the day, I think it also shows a lot of frustration. It demonstrates a lot of frustration that council has had over the years, just in the fact that, you know, Hayward has been doing our part. We have been trying, and we have been, you know, doing, making gains in this space, and without a whole lot of support from surrounding cities. I understand that you are comparing, you know, policies and comparing percentages, but, you know, as a councilman, I'm always looking at, are other cities doing their job, right? Or other cities doing their lifting? And I think the charts that you showed, I think it gives a whole other level of discussion and conversation I think we can be having. Let me see if I can move my bar here. This first slide here is hold on. This is the for sale slide, right? Yeah.
Right. That's right.
So, you know, the increasing inclusionary, the inclusionary requirement to approximately 12%. You know, I heard what Councilmember Wahab said, but I also listened to what you said about, you know, not spiking this number to such a level that it doesn't get us to where we need to be, right? And I think, and so I guess my question is, and this is as I was listening to some of the other stuff, is my question is it a matter of just tweaking these percentages? I mean, is that what we're doing? Tweaking the, you know, inclusionary requirement, you know, lowering the inclusionary requirement on the denser side. I mean, are what we doing just trying to find this balance, or are we, you know, or are we saying, you know what, let's take the inclusionary requirement to 20%? You know, I mean, is it a matter of doing that, or is it or is it really we're trying to, you know, sort of find this balance? I guess that's the question.
And let me jump in, and then Christina and Derek, feel free to jump in. I mean, I will say from staff's perspective, we're very cognizant of we don't want to do anything that inhibits housing production, because we think that's counter to what the objective of the policy is. And so, as you saw from Derek, if you push it too much, you could make a difference. You know, on some of those products, are our fees and requirements what's making it infeasible? Probably not. But on some of those that are more marginal, it could be the difference in kind of affecting feasibility, or it could mean, you know what, it's going to take 2 more years before something's feasible until you get the rents to support that. So, and I think what I was really surprised, and I mean, glad to see, was that even ours are a little lower, but we're actually seeing production, unlike all those other cities. Like you saw that, right? I mean, so it's kind of this, you know, it is a balance. Like, do you really want to be the one who has the highest percentages, or do you want to be the city that's producing the most housing, right? And so I think if it's the latter, staff's recommendations would be a little more on the conservative side. You can always, if the market starts going gangbusters, we can be back here in 2 years and we can look at it again and we could add it. But I think right now, we think we're probably going into a pause in the housing market. You know, these are under current circumstances. It could get worse if interest rates keep going up. So I guess from our perspective, we want to see those housing being produced and inclusionary being produced. So I think we would say, please, our recommendation is to be balanced and a little, not too conservative, but kind of a little on the conservative side.
Yeah.
I don't know if Christina or Derek want to add anything.
No, I think that's a great summary. I mean, just to go back to the results and sort of how this plays out, you know, the types of projects that are sort of marginally feasible can just maybe support some requirements, but, you know, if you push them too high, they won't happen. You can see that sort of happens with the small multifamily project, for example, in which, you know, the bar here has to be above the corresponding dashed line to indicate that it is a financially feasible project at these different market values. And really, it's only in one specific circumstance. I mean, the takeaway is it's just in that bubble. And, that's where it makes a difference. Now, for some of these other projects, it's true, for these really high density projects, this is the one that shows the % increase in rents necessary with different requirements. I mean, there's some range in here with different requirements, but it's a fairly limited difference, and it's not necessarily these requirements that are driving the challenge with these projects. It's the overall construction costs relative to the achievable rents, right? So again, yeah, but there are these situations for these lower density projects.
The other thing too, is if I could just jump in, the other thing too is as you're talking and as I'm listening to the response from Ms. Ott is, have we considered, and I don't know what the number is. I know we've seen the number here on council a few times, but I forget what the number is, or that is. Are we looking at sort of the trajectory of the size of the family? I mean, are we looking on the sort of what are the trends and how big families are today? Are we building, if you don't have to, but if you go back to your slide about small families, that small family house, 2-bedroom, if we were to produce housing for smaller families, what would be the number? Is it 12? I guess, I think you'd probably say yes, but is it 12% that gets us to generate or produce more sort of, smaller family housing? Does that make sense?
I think oh, go ahead, Derek. Well, I was just going to say, I think family housing typically is going to be in like single family homes, townhomes.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure, there are always in multifamily, there would be some larger units, but those are going to on average be a little smaller than the rental. Condos might be a great starter home for a small family. So those also, so we're recommending keeping for condos, which is an ownership, kind of a way for someone to be a first time home buyer with maybe you just had your first kid, right? We're saying keep those at the 7.5%, which is what it is currently. So don't change that, because that product is a little more expensive to build. What we're saying is increase for the bigger products, for the larger families, the more expensive homes, they can support more. And we're saying push that up to the 12%.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just sort of put a point on this. So, I am okay with the 12%. That I think that's a reasonable number. We can arm wrestle whether we go to 15 or 16, but I agree what you're saying about that 12% number. Target moderate income homes, absolutely. I think that's what we've been, we have been talking about for a long time. That's exactly what you just mentioned about, the starter homes, so forth, whether they're, townhomes or the other products that you were talking about. That last bullet, yes, 7.5%. For denser ownership products. It sounds reasonable. My concern is, once what I don't want is, spiking these numbers or increasing these numbers where, we so drastically that we're coming back again in a very short period of time to tweak it again. And I think once we do this, I'd like to sort of sit on it while it sort of takes its course, so to speak. So okay, go to the next slide. Rental housing. I'm very cautious when we start talking about, reducing and taking away in lieu fees, because these are, and I'll just give you one example, and this has been brought up on the council before by a former council member about, once we start taking away in lieu fees for, say, things like, parks, for example, people who live in apartments, they don't, they're not going to have amenities at the apartment or in their complex. So they're going, we're going to have to build a park or have a park nearby, or, or some type of an amenity to accommodate that and to respond to that. So anyways, I'm very cautious with this. I don't mind considering it. I know we've even considered this on a project by project basis. If we, I don't mind to have, I'll support this to be in there, but does this sort of restrict us from making decisions on a project per project basis? Let's say something happens down the road that we have to, not do this. Can we do that?
I will say for projects with like public land projects,
Yeah.
you have the discretion to require as a condition of,
Yeah.
taking city land, that you could say, look, fees are not an option for you. You're, on site. I think, my sense is, and we could check with the city attorney's office, but once you have a policy, and the intent is, and the policy allows for a choice,
Of course.
they should have the discretion to take that choice, or else, maybe we should change the policy. So I think staff would say, anyway, so I think that's where I think that's our perspective. I mean, I think is we should have a policy that reflects what if you're going to give people a choice, let the developers a choice, let them have a choice. If you don't, then that's fine. I think we like the idea of having a choice. We do see it, Christina can chime in, but we do see with some of these townhomes that I think projects that they are preferring to do the inclusionary. So we're getting, I think, those moderate income units, which are the ones where we're kind of most efficient through this inclusionary policy. But we're also giving people a choice to have the fees, and then we can use the fees to really subsidize the 100% projects. And I just want to make a comment, because there was a comment earlier. I mean, Christina and her team are very quick about spending that money. So we are not sitting on it. Since the last 4 years, we have over 700 units of affordable housing that have been through Measure A1, our in lieu fees, and then our public land. So we're spending that money. It's not sitting in an account and not getting units built. Okay. So we like having both, because then we can really target different affordability levels. I don't know, Christina.
I think the only thing I have to add is that when we're looking at what is paying the in lieu fees, they are the smaller projects. On average, there's 5.5 units for the average project that pays the in lieu fees. And so the larger projects, which are the single family home and townhome projects, are choosing to do the on-site inclusionary units. So we are seeing kind of this natural separation between the project types. I think there's one case where a developer requested a modification from providing the on-site. It was a 40-unit project, but needed to pay the fee in order to maintain the project feasible.
Yeah. Okay. You won. That's fine. I get it. Yeah. Okay. The second bullet is that's fine. I'm okay with that. Parking. That's another one of those issues where how much parking is necessary. And are people gonna how many, are people going to be driving, and, what is it going to look like in 20 years or, 15 years? So yeah, explore incentives to enhance the feasibility of rental housing, reduce parking requirements. I don't mind reducing parking requirements. Look at the project that we were talking about in the Economic Development Committee, right? We're looking at that project on the corner of B and Main. I don't think there was any parking, in that, when they brought that proposal to us just to sort of review. I forget how many units. I think it was going to be like 40 something units, and I don't think there was any parking, and they were okay with that. I mean, that was something that they weren't even, sort of putting in the equation. So, I'll, right now I'll say okay, and then we'll, when this comes back to us, I'm sure we'll, have arm wrestle that out later. What's the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's fine. I think that's okay. Yeah, because I know we were talking about that even in the ADUs, right? I think that we do collect in lieu with ADUs, correct? Don't we?
If there's more than 2 units in the project.
Yeah. Okay.
So if it's a single family home with an ADU and the ADU is over, I think it's 720 square feet, then you would be charged the square footage of the ADU.
Okay.
Otherwise, just the single family home.
Okay. Okay. And then what's the next slide?
That was it.
Oh, that was it. Oh, okay. So yeah, thank you. This is when's this gonna when will the council see this, and when will we review this? Oh, here it is.
Well, we don't have a date quite
Oh.
assigned to that, so I'm not exactly sure.
Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to another round of this. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great job. This was good.
Thank you. And I concur. It was good. And I appreciate both the technology, the TAC, and the sort of methodical approach here, as well as the really evaluation of viability. And I have some reaction to that since you asked for reactions, but I'll answer the questions first and then have some thoughts. So in terms of the specific questions, I would love to see our inclusionary requirement go up. I absolutely understand and concur that we don't go to the maximum. I'd love to give council the kind of an up to, although I don't know if that gives enough certainty to the development community. But the number that I was sort of floating around was 14, in my head was 14%, as kind of I'd like to go more than 12, but I understand not going to 16. So the number I came up with was 14. Happy to hear from colleagues about that when we come back to council. And to sort of float that with the TAC and some of the other viability groups that we'll hear from. And for me, the 50-50 is where I'd like to go. I understand the expense of maintaining a house, and yet if we're looking at, we're doing so much work as a city, really great work about inclusion and righting the wrongs of the past and so on, that I don't think we can say no to low income housing, ownership housing as a priority. And I don't think that's what you're saying. I'm just, for me, 50-50 is, I'd love to see. And then, so that's the two. And yeah, that's fine to keep the higher density at a lower amount. I understand that there's, every time it goes up a number of floors, the building costs go up and so on. And that's just a market factor. I don't think we have a lot of flexibility. So, and we want those. They tend to be more affordable by design. And so incentivizing that makes sense to me. So the next slide.
Sure. Would
yeah, feel free.
Apologies. Would you mind if I just to refresh, if anything, my own memory of the findings for the 50-50 scenario? So it was low and moderate, and that was at 15%. So yeah, the 14% idea does fall readily within that, and as I'm sure you already had in mind. So
that's okay.
Yeah.
Good to check me. I appreciate it.
Just checking me.
All good. This is a team effort. And then on the rental housing, I really don't have an appetite for suspending fees on inclusionary. To my point earlier about the diversity, equity, inclusion overcoming redlining, things that we're doing. I cannot sit with okay, we're going to build the market right now. And even with an expedited building schedule, the market rate gets to be here and the low income gets to be here. And that to me does not feel consistent with our values. I also, those products, when we rely on the tax credits, are rentals. And so we're not creating that ownership opportunity, that real thing that changes the equation. So we've talked about that before. I won't belabor the point. I just will ask that so that's my recommendation, that. And yeah, again, I realize that the higher density, the wraps, the podiums, even the stacked flats, which are the thing I really want, are really not particularly feasible. I don't think us changing our in lieu requirements are going to change that equation. So again, not a big appetite for doing that. I do, I appreciate the requiring inclusion. And I understand that there's some flexibility, like we do partial units. What we're doing right now seems to work, but I don't know if it gives developers enough clarity. So I'd be interested in feedback about that. Right now we have the flexibility, but apparently the sense I get is that the message to developers is we want it inclusionary if at all possible. And that seems to be working. Most things that we have some level of inclusion. So I'm happy to pause, although I know we're going to lose some staff after time. So if there's a comment on that, I'll stop for a second, I swear. Okay, then I'll continue. So on the, sorry, can you go back to the,
Oh, sure.
where we just were? Sorry. One thing I wanted to say about, okay, talked about not the incentives. And so then the flexibility. So I am interested in some flexibility. I absolutely know we have overparked neighborhoods, but the state just passed legislation that may limit our ability to require parking anyway. So, I'm very interested in what flexibility we can do in terms of maybe it's timing of paying those fees, of paying a fee, or some other things. And I'll talk briefly about that in a little while. Okay, next slide. Thank you. And then project size. I don't, again, have a lot of appetite for changing even on the smaller projects. I mean, maybe if it was 5, I'd have some appetite. 20 still seems too high for me to be ready to not have inclusionary units in those. And I absolutely get that there's some administrative difficulties, both from the city side as well as from the developer side. And so, is it a good time to talk to Eden INR or another organization to be able to help manage those for both the city and the developer? I don't know, but it's a thought that came to mind. Okay. Anything else on recommendations?
That was it as far as what's in here.
Okay. Then the last thing I'll add just on the commentary is there's a feeling a little bit of sort of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And that's not to say we haven't done great work. We absolutely have. And I appreciate the report. I appreciate all of the housing production. I mean, arena numbers look so much better these days than they used to. Kudos to everybody for that, for sure. I think we have to look at, and yes, I will talk tiny homes too for just a moment. I think we have to think differently. What we don't really need is above moderate housing. We just don't. What we need is deed restricted affordable at various levels. And so really coming back to a model, frankly, like the mobile home units, because it's the only way, and tiny homes, when I'll come back to that in a second, but building units that are affordable by design at the front end to really create that starter home market for people. Unfortunately, the market costs mean it's going to be smaller. It's going to be prefab is not really cheaper, but it's going to be models that we've used in the past, or let's get creative about it, because otherwise what we're going to continue to get is too much market rate and not enough affordable. And that's what I really worry about. And so I know this isn't done yet. And so if there's the opportunity to evaluate, maybe it's the mobile home model as a way to get at this starter home market, I would encourage us to do that. And the last thing I'll say about the tiny homes is that it was very similar to the response there was very similar to the reports that came out about housing first. And it's really how the model is applied. If the model is about, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to put you in a house, and there all your stuff is better, but we don't have anything around you that talks about social needs, psychosocial needs, physical, mental health, getting to use your skills and be valuable in community, then it will fail, just like everything else. And that tiny home, if it's a temporary housing, but there's no affordable housing to step into, if it's only meant as temporary, then it too will fail. And I think that to me is what I took out of the article. So I don't think it's a no-go. I think we have to be really thoughtful about how we design these things. And we have brilliant staff and great consultants who will help us do that. So anything else on this item?
One thing I just want to say is that I know there was a mention of density, and we are bringing to the council on October 18th some suggested revisions as a work session on the density bonus. So I think just to get at your last point, this is one tool in the toolbox. There are other tools. We're not going to be able to solve every problem with just each one of these policies. It's going to take all of them. So I think I just want you to know we're working on other policies that we'll bring to you that will also, we hope, help.
I appreciate that reminder. Definitely. Okay, anything else on this? Great, thank you. We'll move on to our rental housing review. Hello, Dr. Bloom. Sorry, Dr. Kohlblum.
I just realized I wasn't on mute. I'm just going to pull up my screen real quick. Christina, were you going to say something, or do you want me just to dive in?
Just dive in.
Okay. All right. Can you all see the slide deck? Okay, great. All right. So good evening, council members. I'm Amy Kohlblum, and I'm here with you tonight to provide an update on the implementation of the city's residential rent stabilization and tenant protection ordinance, which you know is the RRSO, as well as the tenant relocation assistance ordinance, which we refer to as the TRAO. I'm going to start with a recap of the implementation of the RRSO, and then go with the timeline, and then go a little more in depth into a progress update. We'll do a brief update on the tenant relocation assistance ordinance, and then finish with a summary of some of the changes that have been implemented to our public contact process. I do want to say kind of upfront as a disclaimer that I may say during the pandemic tonight when talking about the data. And what I mean by that is from the time when there were local or state eviction protections in place, which in Hayward was around March 24th was I think our local eviction was our moratorium was enacted. And most of the data tonight, unless I say otherwise, goes through June of 2022, which is when the state moratorium ended. So there's not any data tonight, unless I say otherwise, that is post-pandemic, referring to the presence of eviction protections. So just wanted to put that caveat out there. So this is just a quick timeline that summarizes the history of the RRSO to date. It was enacted in July of 2019. Most of its lifespan has been during the COVID-19 pandemic. In March of 2020, you heard our first update and some recommendations to revisions, which council adopted in July of 2020. Later in September, we came back to this body at the request of the council to present a report on alternative rent increase thresholds. Later in November of 2020, council voted to maintain the existing rent increase threshold of 5%. And then finally, a year ago, September of last year, this task force heard an update on the RSO, as well as the relocation assistance ordinance and some of the COVID-19 policies in response. So with that said, I'll try and kind of remind everybody of what is in the RRSO, but if there are places where I speed through and you need me to clarify, please let me know. Okay, So one of the more exciting updates that we have for you tonight is new data. Through our participation in the Eviction Prevention Learning Lab, staff has requested and received unlawful detainer data from the Superior Court of Alameda County for the entire county. And we've compiled data from January of 2000 through July of 2022. To clarify unlawful detainer data, the unlawful detainer is the legal filing that a landlord submits to the court to execute an eviction. So there's some limitations to this data. Tenants, like there may be tenant displacement that doesn't capture. So tenants may leave after getting an eviction notice before there's a filing, or they may leave before a UD judgment is reached. Also, because of California state privacy laws, we're not able to get pinpoint location data, so we can only go by zip code. But we got all the data in Alameda County, which has made us rather popular with our peers in other cities, as we're able to share this data with them as well. So with that said, we can still look at trends in this data set to see how things are changed over time. So the chart that you see on the screen now shows unlawful detainer data, unlawful detainer filings. So a landlord submitting a filing to the court since January of 2000 for Hayward. And you can see that unlawful detainers peaked in 2008. From 2016 through 2019, the volume kind of leveled out, averaging just under 600 filings a year in the 4 years prior to the pandemic. You can see that COVID eviction moratorium line is right on top of the year 2020 there. So as I said before, the eviction moratorium were enacted in March of 2020. So of the 122 filings in 2020, almost all of them happened before the moratorium. So if we total those that happened in 2020 and 21 and 22, there were only 121 filings since the protections were in place. That was a lot of 20s, but that's kind of the takeaway here, is that since the moratorium were enacted, we've only seen 121 unlawful detainer filings total. We can also, as a reminder, I should say, the RRSO requires that landlords provide our office with copies of all rent increase and termination notices. So when it comes to the termination notices, these range from 3-day notices to pay or quit to 60 or 30-day termination notices, depending on the type of just cause eviction. And again, the landlords are kind of required to self-report these to us. So there are likely some compliance issues and they're not fully comprehensive. Through June of 2022, we've received just under 800 total notices. If we look at kind of the before and after the pandemic protections, 86% of those that we received before the pandemic were for a failure to pay either rent or utilities. Once the pandemic hit and we saw those eviction protections more, so 95% of those termination notices that were submitted to our office were for a failure to pay rent or utilities. And now that we have this unlawful detainer UD data, we can overlay that data with the termination notices we received to kind of see, here are the notices we're getting, how many of them are being filed in the court, knowing that there's some limitations again because of the self-report part of it from landlords. So when we do that kind of overlay, we see that there was, prior to the pandemic, the number of UD filings were greater than the number of termination notices that were submitted to our office. And there was a big increase in termination submissions to our office starting in the second half of 2020. It's likely due to several factors, but we were doing a lot of outreach to landlords and letting them know about what the rules were for complying with state and local moratoria. And that aligns with the fact that there were changes to state law that required landlords to serve 15-day notices of termination in order to access rental assistance. And I think anecdotally, I think we also saw some improved compliance because landlords were paying closer attention. They were talking to us a lot more. And our staff, basically, anytime we're on the phone with a landlord talking about any issue, we kind of check in to see if they've got a covered rental unit. And if so, make sure they know about the RRSO and the their rights and responsibilities under that. So another neat thing about the UD data, or let me take a step back. I'm excited about the UD data. So as I mentioned earlier, the majority of the RRSO's lifespan has overlapped with the pandemic and all of the eviction protections and policies and programs that came with that. So it creates a lot of limitations for interpreting both the UD and the noticing data. However, we did take a look at unlawful detainers that were filed in the 200 days, so a small window, but a window, following the enactment of the RRSO compared to the 200 days before it was in place. So a little bit of a pre and post test. And for any of the data nerds, we did not test for significance here. There's a lot of limitations to this data, so it is more anecdotal. We're not making causal inferences with this data. But we do see a 15% reduction in the unlawful detainer filings following the passage of the RRSO and before there were local protections in place for evictions. So again, this analysis doesn't allow us to make causal inferences, but the trend does suggest that establishing just cause protections and more predictable rent increases through the RRSO may have been contributing to a reduction in unlawful detainers prior to the pandemic. But again, this analysis can't let us say that with a significant asterisk on it or anything. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit from talking about unlawful detainers and termination notices to the rent increase notices that landlords are also required to submit to our office. So they're required to submit copies of all rent increase notices, whether the unit is covered under the rent increase threshold or not. The limitations with this data are similar to those of the termination notices because they rely on landlords doing self-report. Also, as a reminder, there were no local or state rent increase freezes during the pandemic, but anecdotally and based on the rent increase data that we do have, many landlords didn't do an increase during 2020 and the first half of 2021. So this slide that you're looking at here shows the number of rent increases, just the pure number of increases that our office received. The median number of increases that we received during the pandemic was 35. And you'll see there's a substantial spike in notices in 21. And then when you kind of break out the Q1 data, and there's like a big spike in January as well of 2022. And during that time, we saw a lot of like individual landlords doing a big submission of rent increases. So a property with hundreds of units all receiving an increase. So or many receiving an increase. So we see those spikes, and those tended to happen even before the pandemic, where you'd have one large property that was complying with the ordinance, and we'd see a big spike just from that property doing its annual increases. The next slide here, there's a lot of data going on in this chart. It shows a comparison of rent increases between covered rental units and rental units, but also some market level data. So as a reminder, covered rental units, or as we call them, CRU, those are covered by the rent increase threshold of 5%. And then rental units, which we call RU, are not subject to the increase threshold. And as with data that we brought last year, we continue to see lower average rent increases for covered rental units compared to rental units. There have been, as you can see in the last cluster here in 2022, there have been CRU rent increases that are averaging above 5%. And this is because many landlords, as I said before, didn't apply an increase in 2020 or 2021 and are now applying banked rent increases as allowed under the RRSO. So that's why you're seeing that average coming up above 5%. But overall, when we look across all the increases that we've received, CRU still is averaging below 5%, whereas those that aren't covered by the threshold are averaging just above 5%. We also have this market data. It's useful to look at this, but there are a lot of limitations. So first of all, this market data is just for multi-unit properties, and it's just for new leases. So it doesn't capture lease renewals. And we know from the data that was submitted to us that a lot of increases are coming through renewals. It doesn't capture the existing leases or changes to those agreements over time. But you can see in this chart that the market rent increases were lower on average during the pandemic, but have grown pretty substantially in the second half of 2021. And most recently, the most recent data in 2022, they're exceeding the rent increase threshold of 5%. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears from all of the notices and increases to talk about the actual rent review petition process. So actually, I would like to just pause here really quickly to thank Irena for her support on this piece. She helps with the analysis here, and she's been on our team for like, I don't know, 5 minutes and just jumped right in with a lot of things, including helping on this section of the report. So thank you for that. So as a reminder, tenants in covered rental units can submit a petition to our office for a review of rent under certain circumstances. The staff report lists all of them out, but it's often if it's a rent increase or a utility increase that exceeds the threshold, or if there's been a reduction in housing services, or we see a lot of unlawful rent increase notices. So the notice didn't say all the things it's required to say under the RSO. Additionally, landlords can submit petitions for review of rent increase to our office to get approval to pass through half the cost of a capital improvement or to increase above the threshold in order to obtain a fair return. So we've had 96 petitions submitted since the RSO was enacted through June of 2022. And aside from those that are still active, most of them are being resolved prior to or during mediation. So only a small subset are making it all the way to the arbitration side, and an even smaller amount are being rejected because they are not compliant. And with most of those that are being rejected, our consultant works with the petitioner to help them get their petition in order to resubmit. So this year we wanted to give you more information on the types of petitions that we receive aside from just the volume and kind of what happens with them. So this shows our tenant petition types. And you should note that a tenant can select multiple reasons per petition. So they can submit a petition that's both for an increase over 5% and a non-compliant notice of the rent increase. So you can see here that most of the petitions are for increases that are over the threshold. We also saw a lot of petitions for reduction in housing services during the pandemic specifically. So for example, mobile home residents were submitting petitions for lack of access to community facilities because during the pandemic they were closed. And it's not on this chart, but among the few petitions that we've received from landlords, they've all been for capital improvement pass-throughs. To date, we haven't received a petition for a fair return increase. We've had a couple that like were asking questions about it, but to date, no one has met the criteria for one of those. Okay, so that is our RSO update. And I apologize, there's a lot of text on this one. We don't have any pretty charts for you for the trail, but we did want to give you a brief update on just how things are going because it's now been 2 years, which is kind of unbelievable. We've had 20 cases for tenant relocation assistance since the ordinance was passed in the summer of 2020. The majority, the big majority of these have been initiated through a code enforcement notice of violation. So code enforcement goes out for an inspection, issues a notice of violation, and includes an order to vacate for the tenants for health and safety reasons. And their orders will vary in terms of how much time the tenant has to leave based on the severity of the issue. They have a bit of discretion there at code enforcement. So since our last update, we've had, as I said, more of these cases. And additionally, we've established the Tenant Relocation Assistance Fund, which the council authorized as part of the use of the American Rescue Plan Act. The fund allows for kind of two main types of payments. One is payments to qualifying low-income tenants in the event of a natural disaster. And we have paid out just over $100,000 for this so far to date. These have all been for apartment fires across 3 different fires, I believe. I think we have a third fire that we're working on right now. we have worked with landlords in those situations to make sure that the tenants are given access to the funds, and that comes from our fund, not the landlord, because they're not obligated to pay under the TRAO. The other type of payments that we're making are on behalf of non-compliant landlords. So when our office determines under the TRAO that a landlord is obligated to pay relocation assistance, when there's been a code enforcement order to vacate and the landlord won't pay, either they can't or they refuse, we now have this fund to make those payments on behalf of the landlords, and then we can go through an internal process to recover the cost from the landlords through a special assessment on their property. And we we're in the process of making one of those payments now. The implementation of the TRAO, I should say, has been kind of challenging. We have developed several forms and resource materials and we're doing a lot of technical assistance with the different stakeholders involved, but for each case, there are many variables that are kind of unknown and will change from case to case. And we need them to determine the amount of assistance owed, also to know what timeline is triggered. And it's complicated for staff to enforce. It's also really complicated for folks just to understand, kind of from like a lay perspective. So staff does recommend using the strategic roadmap process, this upcoming discussion of the strategic roadmap, to discuss making revisions to the TRAO as an additional activity under the Preserve, Protect, and Produce Housing priority area. So as I wrap up, I do want to touch on one more thing, which is some of the improvements that we've made recently to improve accessibility to the public. We now have a staff member at the permit center during its operating hours. So that co-locates us with other important services like code enforcement and revenues just across the hall. And this kind of helps reduce confusion. It reduces setting people up and down. Sometimes folks can't find us down the hall on the 4th floor. So we found just kind of, it's just better customer service. We are still open for walk-ins during off hours of the permit center, but we found that it's much easier on folks when we're downstairs. We've also started using an online appointment booking system, so people can go online to make a phone appointment or an in-person appointment. And for folks where that's like kind of a tech challenge, we'll also sometimes on the phone with them say, do you want to make an appointment to come in, and we can put that appointment in for them. And then finally, as part of our participation in the Eviction Prevention Learning Lab, which is with the National League of Cities and the Stanford Legal Design Center, we've been making some updates to our website, and we're continuing to make those improvements to improve accessibility, both for search engines and people when they're reviewing the website. So that concludes the update on the RSO. I appreciate your time, and I'll pass it back to Councilmember Landman.
All right. Thank you very much for that work and for the report. I'll open it up for public comment at this point. If there's any members of the public who would like to comment on this item, please let us know by raising your hand. And I'm not seeing any. So I will go back to my colleagues. Who would like to start?
Yeah, I'll go first. I just have a couple of just some minor comments. First of all, thank you. This was a very interesting presentation. So, so thank you for that. A takeaway is, so clearly the moratorium worked. Clearly the protections that we have in there are doing, they're durable enough where they're standing up to to the process, and people are certainly going through it. So which is great. One question I was thinking as you were talking was, I know all of this is sort of quantitative data. Do we have, I'd be interested to see some case studies or some sort of case study data, interviews with a handful of individuals or renters to sort of see what their lived experience was, going through an eviction process, or going through the mediation process, or something like that. I'd be interesting to it'd be interesting to see that. I don't know how in depth, but maybe when this comes back to us, in a much bigger scale, that we find somebody that you know, a couple of cases where we can sort of highlight their experiences. Maybe, and even the landlord, it'd be interesting to see, you know, sometimes we have like post interviews, you know, sometimes, you know, anyways, but it'd be interesting to get some of that data. Also the public outreach, you know, so that last slide that you had, great slide. I know you guys have been doing a lot of work. You guys have been present at a lot of community events, and you know, I know you've been talking to a lot of people, and you know, and I hear it. You know, let me tell you, I'm hearing it firsthand. People coming up to me and telling me that they have spoken to staff, and you know, and they're being ushered through the process. So that's great. And so forth. And with that last slide that you had about, you know, using the priority, the strategic initiative process, or the strategic priority process, I forget what it was, but, you know, to include this, or to apply the TREO program, the TREO strategy or program in that process. Absolutely, let's do it. I know this is a priority, and you know, and clearly it's working. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Councilmember Wahab. Aisha. Okay, we'll circle back, but I'll jump in to add my comments. So I already gave my appreciation, so I'll just go to the comments part, which is, so yes, I concur with my colleague about, concur with Councilmember Salinas about, you know, it's not up to me what's in the strategic planning for this next year, but I certainly would support taking a look at, you know, what would be needed to streamline the process, what would support the implementation. That makes a lot of sense to me. I also wonder if it's worth exploring a technical advisory committee to really dig into the affordability issue. Again, in let me think how to say this, sort of to get at your point, Councilmember Salinas, about hearing the lived experience of renters, hearing the lived experience of landlords. We know that a lot of landlords have experienced people just deciding that they wouldn't pay rent because there was an eviction moratorium. We know that renters still have issues of rents going up above caps, or rents going up twice in a year, or things not being fixed. I mean, there's problems on both sides. And we know that the sort of model isn't affordable just on its face. And so digging into what does that look like and how does it look like? Also, perhaps what are some of the trends that perhaps a La Clinica or our mediation folks or RHA are hearing? I don't know if that's useful, but I throw it out there as an idea for those considering the strategic planning process next year, and whether or not there's capacity to even have such a group. But, you know, rather than restarting that whole conversation of do we revisit this ordinance, but really try and dig in a little bit more about, are there trends that does make sense to address in some way, sort of taking a slower process on that, or a data-driven look at that. And speaking of data, the one other piece that, let me actually ask a question before I say that. Is this just a committee item, our regular update, or does this go to council?
This is just an informational report to the task force.
That's what I thought. Okay, that's fine. Not asking to change that. I think in future updates, it would be helpful to have information to try and gauge, and maybe you already have this from the displacement study, but we know that while the eviction numbers are exciting, we also know that displacement is a lot of rental increases and other things that are not captured by the unlawful detainer numbers. So trying to get a sense of how do we lose people. And the other, sorry, just making sure that Yeah. Oh, the other number that I was curious about for future updates, again, won't be me, but I think would be useful is how many rental units have we lost, if any, if there's a way to understand, have property owners actually taken their rental units off the market. That was a threat when we put in these policies. And I'm just wondering how that played out. I realize, of course, there is the caveat of the pandemic in the middle of all of that, but I am curious how that impacts our rental housing stock.
Thanks. I would just add a small piece in
Please.
response to the questions about qualitative data. The county is doing a survey of landlords to get a better understanding of where they stand in terms of like rental arrears. So it's not the richest qualitative source, but we are putting a link to that in our annual billing and expect to get Hayward specific data back from the county. So that's also a source that we'll have that captures something that we currently aren't able to measure.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know the county is right where we were in 2017 and 2018. Christina?
I also wanted to add that SB 330 prevents housing loss for any units that are protected under our rent stabilization ordinance from demolition. So if they do demolish to redevelop, they would have to provide the replacement unit and give the tenant the right of first refusal. So there is some protections from developing the units and taking them off the rental housing market. And I think we've at least seen a couple of cases recently under the Ellis Act where they've taken the units off, they're proposing to take the units off the rental housing market.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Councilmember Wahab?
No, thank you. I didn't have any additional comments. I do appreciate the staff report.
Okay, thank you. Then we will move on, which I think our last item, just going to that part of the agenda, is the what's coming up in the future. Any additions to the tentative schedule or comments on that from either of my colleagues? Seeing a head shake from Mark. Hearing anything from Aisha. The one comment I had was there are a number of new legislations that either have been signed or might be signed by the end of the month. And I don't know if December is too soon to kind of get an update about how that impacts housing development, you know, the parking requirements one, AB 211, or 2011, sorry. But either December or March, I think it would be useful for this committee to have a sense of that. Perhaps I think we did that a couple of years ago or a year ago. So, okay, thank you. Anything else for the good of the order?
I did want to officially introduce Irene Perez. She is a new member of our team. So excited. She's not new to the city, but new to housing and has definitely been another amazing player to my already amazing team. So I am very excited for her to be assisting us here tonight, and she will be helping us with the Homeless Housing Task Force for this point forward.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Ms. Morales, Irene and I believe her sisters have all been my students. And, over in Dustin's office, Nicole was a student of mine. And so it looks like City Hall is getting infiltrated by all my students. Just saying.
Well, it also seems that we are reaping the benefit of some quality education.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Making Hayward look good, Mark. Nice job. And is it Irena?
It's Irene.
Irene.
But yeah, I go by Irene too. So whatever's easier. Thank you, though.
Happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, and to have you ongoing. We know you were in another department, but great. Welcome. And with that, I will say have everybody a great evening, and we'll reconvene in December. Thanks, everybody.